I see Miguel in the comments with some guitars. All right. We are ready to freaking rock. I see some of my favoriteest people. I'm so glad you have Avies because I certainly can't read anything. So thanks so much for tuning in, guys. For anyone who is new, I am 85% blind. So my co-buddy here, Andrew, he does all the back end fun stuff, and then just also adds to the incredible discussions. So we are super hyped tonight because our guest is someone I've been following since day one, and I know Andrew has here as well. We've shared many of his videos on the show, and frankly, he's really been the only one in indie media who's been on the ground. So I'm so happy to have you here, Louis. Louis is from Status Coup. He's been kind of for the better part of 3 months since the train derailment happened. He's been speaking with people in East Palestine, and he is here to give us some updates. He's actually there right now. So thank you so much for joining us, Louis, and thank you for all of your incredible coverage and necessary coverage.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you all so much for having me and helping get the message out and doing your own reporting on what's going on here as well.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to let Andrew start. Andrew, do you have a question? Or actually, do you want to bring up the article that just came out? And we can start that way. I'm not sure if you guys saw this, but I had, and I'm not sure if she's here. I had Tammy on the other night, Tammy Sy. Her and her husband live in East Palestine, and he's a chiropractor. And she's very knowledgeable about what's going on. And we were talking about these levels and stuff. And then now this report came out. It's pretty daunting. Let's see here. Do you have it up, Andrew?
Yeah. So results come back from independent water testing in East Palestine. Do you want me to read the first few paragraphs?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. So people wanted to know who to trust in the days, weeks, and months following the toxic derailment in East Palestine. Some started calling for independent water testing, but no one really knew what that meant. So KDKA TV took a water test kit to the areas impacted, looking to find out if there's still something in the water. Justin Johnston owns Big Pine Consulting in Pittsburgh and does environmental planning and studies. He first tested the water at Coalbank Run a few weeks ago, and he was repeating it with KDKA TV for a reason. This was one of the sites that had the highest number of SVOCs, so I wanted to do the whole suite at this one again, he said. SVOC stands for semi-volatile organic compounds. The SVOCs that I found, they're also called polyaromatic hydrocarbons, POZ, whichever word you want to use, POZ is the acronym. That's what we found. Most of them are carcinogens, so we really need to pay attention to them because even in small amounts, they can be dangerous, he said. That's just one of the reasons Johnston decided to pay for this testing on his own. He said it was thousands of dollars, but he wanted to know the results himself. The first time he found 11 substances in this water, 6 substances from incomplete combustion, consistent with the plume from controlled burn, and 5 of the 6 on the list are probable carcinogens. The catch is that the Ohio EPA's report didn't detect that. Shocker. Thought mine would look exactly the same, but they didn't, and the reason is simply detect levels, he said. Do you want me to keep going, or should we?
No, that's good. So I know, and Louis, you can say if this has changed, but I know when I've interviewed people in the past, even last month, they've said that to do testing personally and to see if you have any of these chemicals in your body, you have to pay for that. Is that still the case?
that's generally still the case. Up until this point, folks who've wanted to do testing for things in their body, as far as urine testing or blood testing goes, most of that has been out of pocket, as doctors have not generally been writing prescriptions to have these tests done. One exception to that rule is who you mentioned, Dr. Sai, he's actually a chiropractor. I haven't met him personally yet, although I'll be meeting him and his wife on Thursday. To do a sit down with them. So Doctor Sai's a chiropractor who's been, he's got the ability to write prescriptions. No one else was doing it. He was, sees like you all do, and the folks watching, I'm sure, notice that, hey, that makes a lot of sense that if you set a whole bunch of vinyl chloride cars on fire in this small town, that folks should probably get tested to see if they're still being exposed to this sort of thing. So as far as those tests go, folks that I've spoken with have had to pay out of pocket for it for the most part. I've spoken to at least one person now who has been able to get their actual doctor to write a prescription for it. So, but that was only after this gentleman, Eric Kaza is his name, only after he pushed and pushed and pushed. Jordan interviewed him on Status Coup a couple weeks ago. I actually interviewed him in person today. And he had to battle to get these tests done, ask the same questions over and over and over again to, the person at the front desk at the doctor's office, the different nurses who are there, the different doctors, to finally be able to actually have his normal primary care doctor write the prescription for it. And the unfortunate reality here is the reason that's so difficult to do this, and this is kind of something that we're really digging into on this trip that I'm on right now here, we're staying just outside of East Palestine right now, is the CDC is essentially telling people not to get these tests. They're citing a couple reasons that I'm going to paraphrase them a little bit, but they're citing concerns over things such as the accuracy of the tests, which if you look at other federal agencies and what they've done for testing inside of East Palestine, accuracy is a major issue with a lot of the tests that they're doing there, but now they're suddenly concerned about it when it comes to the vinyl chloride urine testing. Another reason the CDC cited that they're recommending not to do them is because the results are difficult to interpret. So are all of the results. I've actually got some of them. This was purely random that it's sitting here, actually, but these are just like preliminary data sheets of like creek testing, and you can't, you're not gonna be able to read it on the screen here, but it's just like columns and columns and columns of really difficult to comprehend chemicals listed with, the range that they're testing at, but not what the ranges of what is safe and what is okay. So yeah, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff that is being done, whether it be testing for, urine or blood in yourself, or trying to have independent testing done in your home or in your area, it's costing people money directly out of their pockets.
So as far as this goes, what is your impression and everyone else's impression there as to why this is so difficult? Do you think that the doctors are getting money from Norfolk? Do you think that they are just scared of their reputation being soiled? Like, what would be the motive for denying your patients, who you are supposed to care for, this basic thing when COVID tests were handed out like candy?
Right. No, that's a good question. I'm obviously gonna have to speculate a little bit here, but I think part of it is that a lot of these doctors haven't dealt with chemical exposure for the most part, or chemical exposure on this level before, and when they're getting guidance from the CDC telling them, hey, this is a bad idea to do it, that's my guess. I think the ones who are hearing this now over and over again, it's been a thing with residents in East Palestine on multiple issues. This is just another one of them where, unfortunately, unless a whole bunch of people make a whole bunch of noise, they don't get anything. The first big example was that with dioxin testing. For the first 3 weeks, no talk of dioxin testing from the contractors hired by Norfolk Southern or the EPA at that point. The only reason dioxin testing has happened at all now in East Palestine is because once residents learned about this, they started raising the red flag on this, saying, hey, we need to start elevating that this needs to be done here. And they frankly had to complain about it. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and finally, they get some dioxin testing. Those results are even now still just trickling out in some cases, though. So I think it could be a case of that where the doctors really don't know. It's not a very common thing to have chemical exposures at this level. I don't think that's a good excuse. I think that at this point, it should be very widespread and people should be able to get the testing done. But in reality, it should have all been done months. Tomorrow is 3 months since the derailment. So it really should have started a while ago, and the testing should have been ongoing in people's urine and blood.
And I think, the validity of what I'm hearing from people is we're still not going to know the depth of this for years to come. There's still going to be things and studies coming out down the road that we don't know about right now. Mm-hmm. As far as healthcare, what are people saying? Are people uninsured and fearing the worst? Are people saying they can't go to a doctor because they can't afford it? Or I've heard pretty bad stories about the clinic they opened. What are some of the things you're hearing as far as how they're being treated, as far as, their health and well-being?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the clinic just because it's a little bit of a sore spot in town. Initially, the clinic that was opened by the state of Ohio, at this point, it was probably 2 weeks or so after the derailment. That was during my first trip to East Palestine. The night before they made the announcement about the clinic, I'd actually spent the night interviewing residents on East Clark Street. These folks basically all had railroad tracks in their backyard the night of the derailment. They heard the train go by, they heard the bang, they looked down their street, it looked like the end of their road was on fire. I spoke with residents who were getting bad rashes, who were having breathing complications and had never had that issue before, actually sending them to the hospital needing nebulizer treatments. Folks dealing with burning eyes, difficulties like their nose almost burning, like hot pepper, if you smell hot peppers or something like this, sore throats, all sorts of the symptoms that you've heard described at this point. And that next day, I actually got a call from one of the residents who I spoke with the night before saying, hey, Governor DeWine is on my street right now. No one's asking him any questions. Get over here as soon as you can. And fortunately, we happened to be like 2 minutes away in a car from that. And I was like, well, we'll head over right now. Sure enough, he's sitting right there. And I asked him, and I'll say too that there were 3 or 4 other camera crews there with journalists standing there. And the governor was just walking away from, chatting with a resident. And none of these other journalists asked the man a single question. You've got the governor of the state of Ohio standing right in front of you, being extremely incompetent in the response at that point. And you're not going to ask this man a single question? That shocked me, obviously. So I asked him, hey, I spoke with all these residents last night, and I was literally able to point to the houses. He was actually across the street. Here are all their health concerns. What should they do? And he points me, to this. We just opened this health clinic today, really raving about all the work that the state of Ohio has done for this. And so as a good journalist, I went to the health clinic right after I had that conversation with him. And sure enough, that health clinic was providing someone to talk to, which I'll say is important in a crisis like this. There's a whole mental aspect of all of this that is really draining on people at the moment. Sure. So they're providing people to talk to. They're providing referrals to doctors. But more importantly, what they were not providing was any sort of actual diagnosis of any kind, any sort of treatment of any kind, any sort of prescriptions of any kind, and no testing of any kind. Blood or urine testing, none. I don't know about you guys, but that doesn't sound a whole lot like a clinic to me.
It sounds like a secretarial something.
Mm-hmm. And
I saw an interview with one woman who said, I went in there for a test and they did it and the levels were high. And they said to me, I don't know what kind of drugs you're on. Yeah. So they're trying to, basically just rationalize anything that happens. I tried to look into who is funding this so-called clinic.
Mhm.
Have you found anything? Because I feel like Norfolk has got to do something with it, but have
Right.
you found anything?
Initially, I know it was the state of Ohio. I know now this clinic actually does provide some actual medical services. It took weeks for them to get there. But at this point, I don't know exactly who is funding it. I believe it still might be tied into the state at some level. But it wouldn't surprise me, though, whether it be the state or Norfolk Southern. To me, the response at the state level has been wholly inadequate. The governor of Ohio still hasn't technically declared a state of emergency over this.
Right.
It's my understanding that if a state of emergency was declared, it would free up additional federal resources and money to actually have agencies like the CDC is involved, but it's not like you're seeing CDC people on the ground here. There was a few, they were studying things a couple weeks ago who actually got sick while they were here. That there was a story that CNN actually reported on, a rare one. But the state government potentially not handling the clinic in the most up and up way wouldn't surprise me very much. I also have reports of people at the clinic, especially in the early days, who they'd go in with rashes, and in those early days, I mean, I would say at least half of the people that I was talking with were having some sort of rash or chloracne or something like that. And the clinic was, in some cases, just telling people, don't worry about the rash. It's the stress. You're just stressed out. And like, yeah, sure, people are stressed out for sure. But you're telling me that half of this town has rashes because of the stress? I don't think so. In addition to all of the other, symptoms that they were having.
Right.
Yeah.
I have seen some reports, mainly when it first started, but I have seen, and a lot of them were on status quo, that some people, when they were going to the hospital, they were being asked to take a decontamination bath or something. Are they still doing that?
At this point, I don't think that they are still doing that. But a resident that I've gotten to know fairly well over the last couple months doing this, Candace DeSanzo, her young child, I'm forgetting the specific age, but toddler, was, she lives right in East Palestine, not far from the train tracks, and her five children were experiencing symptoms, and one of her children in particular was just absolutely lethargic, barely moving, having a hard time breathing. The whole drive over to the hospital, she was obviously extremely worried, as any mother would be in that case. And that was the first thing that happened when they got into the hospital was, she describes it to me as, they stripped her child naked and literally like hosing them off before being seen by a doctor, which, and at that point, people were told it was safe to be in town. You're telling me that it's safe to be in town, yet these people are needing a decontamination shower before a doctor will see them? I'm sorry, but that's outrageous.
I remember that exact video with Candace. It broke my heart because I'm not a mom, but I cannot fathom that. Oh my God.
Yeah.
So scary. Andrew, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm just curious, going off a little bit of what you were saying when you met up with Governor DeWine, right? It's pretty clear, obviously, that on the federal level, on the state level, it's been very negligent. I'm curious to hear. I think you mentioned previously in one of your other interviews, I think it was on Bad Faith, that the mayor at East Palestine is part-time. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about what it looks like on the local level. Are the local politicians, since I imagine they actually live and breathe in that area, so it's a little bit more of a self-interest for them to advocate and do something, like what is their role in this? Have they been doing anything? Have they been just as negligent as the state and federal level? Just give a little insight of that, because that's one thing I haven't really heard when it comes to actual accountability and just hearing what people on the local level could be doing.
For sure. I'll say it's kind of ebbed and flowed over time. The last time I was in East Palestine, about before this trip, back in April, It may have been late March. The dates are kind of blurring together on me at this point. But we actually attended a city council meeting that was happening in East Palestine, and you're right. So this is a very small community, right? Roughly 5,000 people live in East Palestine. You're right that the position of the mayor is literally, it's a part-time position. I believe he has other work in addition to being a mayor. And that's common in small towns like this in Ohio and elsewhere in the U.S. But there is also a small city council as well. And we went to that meeting, and residents were expecting to be able to ask questions and things like this. It had been a bit since there had been like kind of any sort of real town hall or anything like that, and there was zero opportunity for any sort of engagement from anyone in the room. The discussions about the derailment from the city council was very quick. They basically talked a little bit about the progress of the tracks being removed on one side, and where they were with that. But the discussion around the derailment was very limited, no new information, and that shocked me a little bit. We were really expecting, and the people in the room were expecting there to be a lot more. I had several residents come up to me right after that and express those concerns. As far as what they're doing now, there's been a bit of a rift in town where the people who are still speaking out and the people who have gotten quiet. This is kind of like developing, especially in the last couple weeks. So subject to change, but there's money coming in from Norfolk Southern in a lot of cases into the community, but it's being spent seemingly on a lot of the businesses in town rather than getting to the residents. Now, these are small businesses who are no doubt suffering in this. These aren't, millionaires or anything running their businesses. These are people who definitely need, could use the help. But the money isn't getting to the residents. The help, a lot of these residents aren't even asking for for money. They want help. If you can give them a place to relocate to, if you can make up the difference in what the value is lost on their home, that sort of thing. So it's seeming like the mayor and the council are more so in the direction of the kind of business owners and money coming from Norfolk Southern that's being directed and the questions being answered to the more like the Chamber of Commerce side of things rather than regular folks in town. I actually was on a live stream just a couple hours ago with local resident Jamie Wallace, who she's an organizer here who has been running what's called the Unity Council. She's trying to get folks from all kind of facets of the East Palestine community, as well as folks over in Pennsylvania as well, who are being very much affected by this too, over in Darlington, and even beyond. And she invited the new kind of community liaison person from Norfolk Southern, who's helping to get these funds spread out appropriately, or not so appropriately, to the Unity Council meeting. The person didn't show up. So it's interesting. I have tried to reach out to the mayor on multiple occasions at this point, not getting any responses. He hasn't really done much as far as interviews are concerned in the last month, maybe more. There may be a couple, but it's nothing groundbreaking. He did do a town hall meeting probably a little over a month ago now, where he did share some information, and I thought, after that meeting, I was like, oh, he's seemingly, that's why I said it's ebbed and flowed a little bit. He at that point was advocating pretty well on behalf of residents and speaking with residents that I've talked to quite a bit. He shed some light on some of the closed door meetings that happened in regards to the controlled vent and burn and all of this sort of stuff. But now, from what I'm hearing, it's seeming like he's gotten fairly quiet, and the motivations may have changed. In general, it seems like Norfolk Southern is slowly coming in and trying to quiet down, playing whack-a-mole of quieting down anybody who's speaking up. It's a wild game, and we'll see ultimately where it all ends up. But it's a shifting situation. I rambled a little bit there, so if I didn't answer your question,
no,
please.
that's totally good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, what do they think? And, I'm just going to preface, people like the ones on The View who say, well, they voted for Trump, seriously, fuck right off. That is so disgusting and repulsive. But what do they think about Biden? 3 months in, nothing. Not that he would do more than a photo op, but the fact that he has not even come.
Yeah, and it's not even that he really hasn't even come. He's almost just like Biden himself has barely even mentioned it at all. You know, and even Secretary Pete Buttigieg kind of like had this very like arm's length approach where they like waited a really long time to come, and then when he did come, he had waited too long. So I was here during his visit, but it happened so quickly we didn't even catch up with him. He showed up at like 7:00 in the morning, did a quick tour of the site, did an unannounced press conference really early.
Pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Get his pictures, do an unannounced press conference where I'm sure they hand selected a couple media outlets who they knew weren't going to ask any questions or ask very easy questions. And then, you know, he's out of town in 2 hours. So I think that, Biden absolutely dropped the ball on this. There was an opportunity early on in this for, the Biden administration, the Pete Buttigieg to kind of come in here and really save, not save the day, but like come in here and be like, you know what, like you're all just as American as everybody else. I know you didn't vote for me, but like this is a huge deal. This is terrible. The railroad shouldn't be able to get away with all of this sort of stuff. We need to, make sure that you all are made whole, but also make sure that this doesn't happen again in another town. And that hasn't happened. I was also here during the Trump visit, and East Palestine's absolutely a Trump town as far as the politics go. They voted overwhelming for him in 2020, and folks were excited to see him come, but also understood that it was a photo op for the most part. But at that time, people were like, "Hey, we'll take anybody here that we can get."
Anyone to bring attention.
Yeah, exactly, and they're not wrong in that. I mean, that the amount of media that parachuted in for the Trump visit, we were here for like a little over a week during that span, and the number of media who showed up the night before Trump got there was insane. I mean, town was crazy. So people see Biden and are just like, what did this guy do anything for us, really? And I can't blame them for thinking that, because what did he do? And I'll also add that in a lot of cases, it's easy for folks to be like, oh, Trump rolled back all of these, railroad regulations back during his term as president. But at this point, Biden's been president for 2.5 years. He could have brought them back, number one. And number two, you had the big railroad workers trying to strike back in December. And President Biden, frankly, he frankly squashed that almost unilaterally, saying, "Yep, we're not going to let that happen." One of their main demands was increased, safety stuff, and I don't think you can ignore that.
I just want to ask a follow-up question regarding that. I mean, I think regardless of whether or not a lot of them voted for Trump or, Republicans, I'm curious, we obviously have a very similar take in terms of how this happened, right? Lack of regulation that kept getting peeled back, right? And then, of course, corporate interest pushing those lack of regulations, which caused this disasters to happen and is causing more and more train derailments to happen. Would you say putting that many of the presidents that you've talked to there seem to have a general understanding of like, this is corporate greed, this is what happens when lack of regulation, right? Or would you say their take on the maybe key players that they are blaming might be slightly different?
So I've had a lot of interesting conversations with folks, and I think that there is a lot of overlap. We're not going to agree on all of it. Some of them, when you start, if you get too much into regulation, they might say, the government's going to probably bungle the regulations, and I don't necessarily disagree with all with all of that. I do think that there needs to be more regulations, but it wouldn't surprise me if whatever regulations are passed, there's a million carve-outs that aren't really going to make a difference. But the one thing that everyone really clearly agrees on, and I'm going to drive it back to a conversation that I had on my first trip here, I was sitting in the local bar, basically bar restaurants called the Roadhouse.
That's where our rally is.
Yep. Yeah.
In
So
July.
and it's a great little spot. So I walked in there on the first trip, and walked in and kind of looked to the left of the bar area and recognized two residents who I had spoken with earlier in the week. They kind of waved me over to come sit with them. So me and my cameraman went over, sat with them, had a couple beers, enjoyed lunch, and we're just like talking. It was honestly a really great experience of like getting a feel for what the town really was like, right? We're sitting at like a nice C-shaped bar, so everyone can kind of like talk with each other. And so we were talking about, obviously, all the derailment happening. This was like a couple days after the Trump visit. And one of the residents sitting at the bar said to me, after we were talking about like how do you prevent these sorts of things from happening, and we talked about regulations, we talked about the importance of like voting in primary elections, regardless if it's a Republican primary or a Democratic primary, so that you can get fresh faces into government, because so many of these seats are, in the general election, is mostly decided. We covered all sorts of ground. But something that one of the residents said to me was kind of regardless of the party, Democrat or Republican, they're two wings of the same dirty bird. And they also saw the highlights of, not the highlights, but the negative effects of money in all of this. The fact that not only do many members of Congress, in the House and in the Senate, both sides of the aisle, own stock in, whether it be Norfolk Southern or CSX or these big banks that own large portions of them, JP Morgan, Vanguard, all these companies. And then the other way around of not only do these, members of Congress own stocks in these companies, but these companies contribute massively to these politicians so that they can continue to win their seats. So they see that, regardless of, if a lot of the folks in East Palestine are right-leaning, there's also plenty of left-leaning, residents there, but all of them clearly see the issue with money involved in all of this. And I think that's a real kind of unifying thing behind it. Unfortunately, that's a hard problem to solve, as we see with all sorts of issues. But
as far as, monetary means, are people, not just because they have to buy their own tests and stuff, are they struggling more so? I mean, I know some people are paying for hotels and some businesses are scared to reopen. And so what is that like? How much worse has poverty gotten in the past 3 months?
It's interesting. So East Palestine in general is, generally speaking, not a wealthy town. The median income as of the 2020 census was roughly $28,000 a year. So folks were, in a lot of cases in not the best financial positions to begin with. So in the very early days of this, before there was any sort of infrastructure set up, albeit regardless of how bad that infrastructure is set up now, as far as getting reimbursements and things like this, a lot of folks couldn't afford a hotel for more than a night to kind of get away. I've spoken with some people who, the first night when they got evacuated at 10 o'clock at night after the train derailed and they were told to leave, just drove to the edge of town and slept in their car for the night, because you don't know what the heck's happening, number one, at that point, and number two, it's just like, do I want to spend almost $200 on a hotel when everyone in this town is also going to drive to these hotels right now and deal with all of that. So in general, though, as far as people's financial situations now versus before, it's a little complicated. So many folks have been able to get relocation money temporarily, but they'll need to kind of continuously go back to this Norfolk Southern Assistance Center to get it. And
I've heard stories.
Yes, and people have varying.
Ask Tammy about her experience.
What was that?
Ask Tammy about her experience there.
I will on Thursday, and I mean I've heard some plenty of horror stories as well, and it's very if you get this one representative, you might get the money. If you get another one, you might not. If you go in there and you cry, you might get the money. If you go, and it's like, it's terrible that it's like come to that, but that is like what some of these people need to do
at a church
to make it happen. Yeah, it is at a church too. Yes, yes. Varying degrees of success as far as getting money goes. The process is very messed up. I won't get into that unless that's a question for later. But as far as financial situations, the tricky thing is a lot of folks have gotten into a position who they've saved up and they finally bought a house. Buying a home in East Palestine is fairly affordable compared to the rest of the country. You can buy a house for $100,000 with a decent sized house. So people, the ability to buy a house here, not as impossible as it is in other parts of the country. Although when you factor in, the median income, it's still a massive hurdle. So what is happening now? I spoke with a resident today who bought his house about 9 months ago in East Palestine. Pretty bad timing, unfortunately.
Oh my God.
The house, even just following it on the estimated value on some of these real estate sites, it's currently worth something like $12,000 less than when he bought it, less than a year ago. Nobody's talking about how do you make people whole there. There's not a whole lot of people lining up to buy homes in East Palestine right now, as you could imagine. So in some cases, people's immediate bottom line might not necessarily be drastically different unless they've had a hard time getting some of this Norfolk Southern relocation money, which some people have. So those people, absolutely, their financial situation is going to be trickier. But even in the larger scheme of things where, residents have bought their house, a lot of families their families have lived in East Palestine for multiple generations in some cases, or at least had a house passed down to them. Those houses, not to say that they're worthless, because they're obviously not worthless at this point, but and I mean, unless at some point we get more answers on some of these questions, and maybe they are. I'm not saying that that's the case, but their kind of longer term assets, their homes, their businesses, have absolutely lost value. If they wanted to sell their house and leave, they're gonna have a hard time doing it right now, just because who's gonna buy that house? So yeah.
Wow. So it's a hostage situation. You can stay there and risk your health, or you can take a fraction of what your home is worth. That means so much to you, and try to get how can you even decide that?
No, and that's a good way a hostage situation is a good way to describe it. Yeah, it's and it's I was referring. I might steal your hostage situation line at some point, but I was describing it to a lot of people as the impossible situation. It's do you stay, continue to get sick, risk your kids getting sick, or do you pick up and leave, not really be able to sell your home, and you're on the verge of homelessness or bankruptcy or whatever it may be, trying to go elsewhere, and not to mention you're leaving your job, you're leaving all the people that and all of these other things. So yeah.
Wow. Andrew.
Yes. Give me 1 second. So I just want to clarify, because one of the things I remember you were saying is that the devices that were being used originally were not sensitive enough to pick up toxic chemicals, right? So I just, want you to say a little bit more about that, and who originally provided these testing devices that were not sensitive enough?
Yeah, so I've dug a lot into this. So essentially, the devices that I've talked a lot about and that we've actually gotten admissions from the US EPA about are devices that were used in the kind of home residential testing. So in the days after the controlled burn, in quotes, folks were, told it was safe to go back to their homes, but if they wanted a residential air test to be done in their home to kind of give them the A-OK, that could be provided. Those tests were being done by a combination of a contractor hired by the railroad as well as a contractor hired by the US EPA. Both of them were using basically the same devices. In some cases, a second device might be brought in as well. But for the most part, the devices that were being used were these kind of handheld detectors. It's called a photoionization detector. It's a PID for short. And they were going into these homes. Many of the tests to test a whole home, they were doing them in 10 minutes in a lot of cases, regardless of the size of the house. Kind of walking around and it was giving a reading in parts per million for VOCs, volatile organic compounds. A bunch of chemicals kind of fall into the basket of a VOC. Vinyl chloride is a VOC. There are other chemicals that are VOCs, but a couple major issues with it. Number one, these devices don't test at all for a lot of the chemical byproducts of vinyl chloride that's been set on fire. So I've been speaking with chemists and all sorts of people on a lot of this stuff. So when you burn vinyl chloride, a couple of the byproducts include phosgene, it includes formaldehyde, it includes hydrogen chloride, among other things. Dioxin falls into the category as well. With those handheld PIDs, formaldehyde, one of the ones I mentioned, you can only test for formaldehyde if it has a special attachment on the end of it. But when you have that special attachment on the end of it, you cannot test broadly for VOCs. We don't have any residential air test results that have anything other than VOCs or VC for vinyl chloride on them. So we know that they haven't tested for formaldehyde in people's homes. The next one on the list, phosgene. You're never going to get a reading for phosgene with a PID. It won't work. Multiple folks on and off the record have explained that to me. That's another one. With both phosgene and formaldehyde, if you can smell it in the air, it's already above the level of concern where you should not be there. And then the one other chemical that is not sensitive enough to read it at levels where it would be a concern is butyl acrylate. That is one that the EPA admitted that the devices that they're using, the lowest level that it can detect it at is 0.1 parts per million. And butyl acrylate is only, butyl acrylate's action level, that level where you shouldn't be exposed for longer periods of time, is 20 parts per billion. So that is the equivalent of, it's the equivalent of 20 parts per billion, but the reading can only pick it up at 100 parts per billion. So 5 times the amount is where it will actually start to read it. So there is a whole host of things, obviously, wrong with that. And one other point I'll make with that is a lot of the smells that were happening in town. The smells are many times early on were being attributed to butyl acrylate because it does have a low odor threshold, but they couldn't tell you if it was butyl acrylate or not because the devices that were using, they couldn't pick it up. And then again, like I mentioned, both phosgene and formaldehyde, if you can smell it, it's already above the level. So they were just conveniently picking the one that has a low odor threshold that is close to or below where it's a level of concern, to kind of, distract people or something at this point. But at this point, it could be incompetence, yes, but you would hope that these agencies aren't as incompetent as they're appearing to be. So I don't even know what.
But if they're not incompetent, they're nefarious. So
right.
I'm not sure which one is better.
They're both terrible. Right.
Yeah.
It's not good options. Yeah. Yeah.
Are they talking about doing some kind of collective lawsuit, some kind of action against Norfolk or even the local government? I mean, I know I'm comrades with Steven Dunsinger, so I know it's not a quick process, but are they talking about doing anything, to try to at least hold them accountable on a level of law of some kind?
I believe there's a handful of class action lawsuits at this point. There are also people who have their own lawyers involved in this. The tricky thing is a lot of the folks involved in the lawsuits, it kind of depends on who it is, but some people, they'll talk to me off the record, but they can't, they're like, oh, my lawyer said I can't do interviews. My lawyer said I can't, if I do an interview, I have to be careful that I don't say this, or this. And at that case, the people are just, they don't have much to gain from coming out in an interview at that point. So, there are lawsuits that are being developed, class action lawsuits, but it's hard for me to gain much information about them, unfortunately, just because of the nature of how that stuff works. I know that like Erin Brockovich's the law firm that she works with has a presence in the area still. I'm not sure that they're actually involved in one of the class action lawsuits. I would imagine that they are, but I unfortunately don't have many of the specifics surrounding some of that.
Andrew, do you have another question?
Yeah. So curious to hear, so as you continue to visit East Palestine, what has the overall mood been amongst the residents? Are they kind of just continuing to do kind of what they were doing previously? Is it very solemn? Just curious to hear a little bit about what the atmosphere is like there amongst the residents at this time.
Yeah, I would say a lot of them are pretty tired. It's been an uphill battle for a lot of them, but there is a bit of a divide, I would say. There's a small segment of folks who are, whether they're feeling sick or not, are just like, we need to get back to normal. So there's
the Easter egg hunt.
Yes, the Easter egg hunt is a good example. Yes. So that is a segment, but I would say most of the folks that we're speaking with, they're still fighting. They're still fighting hard. They're trying to get organized. Many of them are organizing and doing a good job of it. But it's yeah. I mean, they clearly see that they're not going to get real help from their government, unfortunately, at any level, unless they really get their acts together and get some sort of unified message out there. Something with all sorts of disasters like this, and me hearing from my colleague Jordan Sheridan with Status Coup as well, with all of his reporting he's done in Flint, Michigan. He was just there last week actually covering the 9-year anniversary of Flint.
Wow, it's been 9 years.
It's been 9 years, yeah. And I'd encourage folks too, if watching, if you're interested to see some of that coverage, as well as we've got all sorts of stuff coming from this trip that I'm on right now in East Palestine on Status Coup. To check out some of that stuff on the Status Coup YouTube channel. It's just youtube.com/Status Coup. We've got all sorts of stuff coming out, and it's we need people to help. The more folks can subscribe and help us out, or consider helping out financially, is the way that we're able to continue to do this, because it's tough. There's a lot of travel. I'm staying in a hotel right now, rental cars, all that sort of stuff. But it's but what getting back to my point, things Jordan's talked to me about is residents in these towns obviously have different opinions on how things should be done, and it's tricky because in this case Norfolk Southern and some of these agencies are really trying to divide people into camps and split people up, because the more divided everybody is, the more divided everybody is, the easier it is to squash any sort of real sort of like uprising or something like that, if you will, of people speaking out. And so that's definitely something that's going on, and there are people working really hard to make sure that those different factions of the community can really get together and rally around trying to get some real help here.
Absolutely. Andrew, can you play that video clip that Lewis did today of this woman? I was in tears. It's powerful.
Is it a perfect test, but number of folks in town now who are testing positive for this thioglycolic acid, they're saying that it would be almost impossible to align this to something else, that when this is happening so widespread in this town, that it's definitely going to be attributed to the tanker cars filled with vinyl chloride that were set on fire in this small town. I guess, what is it? What was your reaction to seeing that news when you first got those results?
Well, your life stops in a second. Everything that you have planned and wanted, all I've ever wanted is to be a grandma. And I don't want to rush my daughter to do that, but am I going to be around to be a grandma? Her boyfriend, no, neither one of us sleep in this town. He is here for school. School's supposed to be safe.
Mhm.
He doesn't smoke. He's 18, an athlete. He has an insurance as well. That's telling me when you're at the school, you're not safe. Somebody needs to start being honest. And they need to really start helping us.
Yeah.
Someone in this country should be able to help our town. You've did more for us than anyone.
And
The doctor informed me that mine was the highest that he had seen to date.
yours is the highest that I've seen as well, and I've seen quite a few as well. Yours was in the like 0.9 or so, and we'll
9.4.
show folks what it is. But yeah,
Of
And I-
all the things to take first place in, this is something that you don't want to be first.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Just I mean, I've spoken with Chrissy a lot over the last couple months. Met her on my second trip in town. Even when I'm not in town, we talk on the phone at least once a week. And her story is heartbreaking, and it's tough because there are just so many of these heartbreaking stories, and it's hard to, you know, it's hard to. I mean, it's nothing for me in comparison to what they're dealing with, but it's hard to just over and over again. It's not one or two people dealing with this stuff. It's really the whole community. You know, you get to see some of them. There was on the last trip, Lonnie, who's she lives in town. She has a small little shop in town as well, and you know, that was another one. It was just absolutely heart-wrenching listening to what the effects of this are having on these people, not only physically, like in Chrissy's case, like we heard right there, where she's you know, testing positive for this vinyl chloride metabolite in her urine, but on the mental side of all of this as well. You know, Lonnie, who I mentioned, she says she's suffering from PTSD from this, is needing to speak with a therapist on a regular basis, you know, waking up with nightmares and whatnot because this happened in her backyard, essentially. It's outrageous. It's outrageous.
So, you know, on that note, as someone who's going to East Palestine, I'm in Harrisburg, PA.
Mm-hmm.
What has it done to you mentally? What is it like to witness the pain that people are going through and seeing them just be blatantly ignored?
Yeah, it's like you're in the Twilight Zone or something. It doesn't feel real. Especially, it's always weird. Like the day I go back home, I live in Austin, Texas, and you know, I'll be here, and then the next day I'm home and going and doing some just very like normal things like you'd go do in any, you know, city, and it feels like it shouldn't happen. You know, before I started doing all of this, you know, you want to think that these government agencies aren't as bad as they really are. You want to think that these politicians would actually come in if something really bad happened and get their act together and do something. You'd think that people wouldn't, you know, need to jump through a million hoops to get a vinyl chloride urine test like in Chrissy's case, and you just see thing after thing after thing, and now coming back here 3 months later, still again and again and again, and seeing none of it change as far as getting actual help. I mean, it's draining. I wish that other media outlets were also coming, like bigger media outlets would come on a more consistent basis and help get this out to a larger thing. You know, at Status Coup, we're doing as much as we can to try to get the message out there. But, you know, we there needs to be even more push to get the message out and to put pressure on these politicians and leaders to actually lead. Right now, nobody's seeing it. The residents aren't seeing it. I haven't seen it. I doubt you guys are seeing it either. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
I can't even fathom. It's gonna definitely be hard. You know, I've said this before, and I'm gonna say it again, and I'm probably gonna say it again after that. a lot of the so-called indie media aren't even talking about it because it's less sexy than, you know, what other YouTubers said today and things like that. And I miss when indie media was about substance. I've been doing my show almost 6 years, and this is what's important, these things. Like, and I hope one day we can get back to that. But that's one thing, you know, Jordan and I disagree with like a lot. But we've stayed, you know, cordial and connected because one thing we always talk about is we actually cover the issues. So even if we don't agree on everything, we actually still talk about substance. So I'm, you know, mad props to Status Quo for covering so much Flint, for covering East Palestine. What you are doing is so important. And it's, I know certainly as a disabled person who, you know, doesn't have the means to do that, I am so envious. So I cannot thank you enough. And I know it means the world to these people. Andrew, did you want to say anything?
No, I mean, I just want to echo a lot with what Joy was saying. Props to you for continuously making the journey, and props to you for not only talking to the residents, but really talking to them frequently, developing those relationships, because I'm sure it means a lot to them when they feel so isolated from everywhere else to at least be able to tell their story. And this is one way that we continue to bring people together at a time where we're all very cynical. We're all very divided and anxious, and you know, so yeah, thank you for all you're doing.
Yeah, no, and I mean, thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, I mean, and honestly, like, yeah, the thanks even to a lot of the residents in East Palestine. I mean, I've you know become friends with some of these people. I talking to them so much and trying to understand more of their situations. It's again, it's heartbreaking. It's hard to imagine this happening to, you know, like, you know, what trying to put yourself in their shoes, trying to, you know, think about if it happened to family members. I mean, this happened in East Palestine this time, but you know, whether it's a rail disaster like this or something else, I mean, there are so many ticking time bombs in the United States right now that have the potential for disasters that look something like this. And what are we gonna do collectively to prevent that from happening?
Absolutely. Well, again, I cannot thank you enough. If you are in East Palestine when the weekend of the rally, I do hope to just meet you and give you a huge hug. I hope that you can come out. Again, thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to Status Coup. Please follow Lewis. This has been a show I've wanted to do for 3 months, and I'm so freaking glad that I was finally able to have you on and talk about these things. Continue doing what you're doing because it means so much. You guys, you can go to m4m4all.org. We've done over 60 actions across the country in the past 2.5 years. And this time I was like, I'm done with DC. We're going to East Palestine. So definitely check it out. We do have a Give, Send, Go just because we are all volunteers. And I can't drive, so I have to get public transportation, which is kind of ironic to get from Harrisburg. But yeah, so anything always helps. But yes, look into more details for that. I do also need some more speakers. So even if you're in, rural PA or East Palestine, as long as you support national improved Medicare for all and you have a story, please reach out. We definitely want to hear from you. But again, thank you so much, Lewis. I cannot tell you enough. and sending love from Harrisburg and all my viewers.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Take care.